November 1922. The Valley of the Kings, Egypt. Howard Carter's excavation team breaks the seal on a small antechamber deep inside Tutankhamun's tomb. The air that rushes out is ancient stale warm, carrying the compressed silence of 33 centuries. By torchlight amid the gilded furniture and folded linen and the accumulated treasure of a boy king's afterlife, a local worker notices something unremarkable. Clay vessels, ordinary ones. He pries the lid from one of them. Inside, honey. Still amber, still viscous, still faintly impossibly fragrant. Not fossilized, not crystallized into something unrecognizable. Honey as usable in theory as anything you might find on a kitchen shelf this morning. 3,300 years in a sealed tomb, and it had simply waited. No other food on earth does this. Not wheat, not wine, not salt-cured meat. Nothing comes close. But the real question isn't how honey survived 3,000 years in a tomb. The real question is what humans were willing to do to each other and to the natural world to get it. Because this story doesn't start in a pharaoh's tomb. It doesn't start with human beings at all. To find the true beginning, you have to travel back approximately 100 million years to a world without grasslands, without birds, as we know them, without a single flowering plant yet in existence. Then, in what paleobotanists describe as a near-sudden explosion of biological complexity, flowers emerged. And with them bees. The two evolved together, each shaping the other across millions of years in an arrangement so precise it resembles something designed. Time Tutankhamun was sealed into his tomb in 1323 BCE. That relationship was already ancient beyond comprehension. The earliest definitive evidence of human honey-gathering cave paintings discovered in the Cueva de la Araña spider cave near Valencia, Spain, dates to approximately 8,000 BCE, 8,000 years before Egypt's New Kingdom, 10 millennia before Carter's torchlight. So where does the human relationship with honey actually begin? The answer involves a cliff, a woven basket, and a very bad idea. In a limestone cave near Valencia, Spain, painted in red ochre 8,000 years ago, an unknown artist left us the first visual record of humanity's relationship with honey. The figure clings to what appears to be a rope ladder or woven vine stretched across the face of a cliff. One arm disappears into a rock crevice. Around the figure, unmistakably bees. Casual scene. This is documentary evidence of extraordinary risk undertaken for extraordinary reward. Imagine that moment. The deafening buzz echoing off stone walls. The burning stings across bare arms and face. The terrifying height. The waxy sweetness finally reached after a climb that could easily have meant death. For what? A substance that, unlike any other food, simply would not spoil. That healed wounds faster than anything else available. That provided energy, unlike anything else known. Reward calculus has defined our relationship with honey ever since. The pattern repeated independently across continents. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Hadza people of Tanzania still practice cliff-face honey hunting today, using techniques identical to those depicted in Spanish caves. In Nepal's Annapurna region, Gurung honey hunters scale impossible cliff faces with handmade rope ladders to harvest giant Himalayan bee colonies, a practice photographer, Eric Valley, documented in stunning detail in 1988. Half a world away, the Maya of Mesoamerica cultivated the stingless bee Melipona beechei in hollow logs called jawbones, considering the creatures sacred messengers between earth and sky. None of these cultures understood why honey preserved, why it healed, why it never spoiled. They knew only that it did, which made it feel like magic. Magic demands reverence. Magic inspires fear. Magic changes the people who encounter it. Perception honey as something beyond normal food, beyond normal understanding, would shape every civilization that encountered it for the next 8,000 years. But magic eventually demands explanation. and the people who came closest to understanding honey without microscopes, without chemistry, without any of the tools we take for granted, were doing something far more sophisticated than anyone gives them credit for. By approximately 2400 BCE, Egyptian beekeepers had solved a problem that would challenge agricultural scientists for millennia: how to manage tens of thousands of individual insects as a single productive unit. The solution was both elegant and revolutionary. Horizontal clay cylinders, each about 3 feet long, stacked in massive apiaries that could house hundreds of colonies simultaneously. In 2007, archaeologists at Tel Rehav, Israel, uncovered 30 intact hives from approximately 900 BCE, the oldest managed apiary yet discovered anywhere on Earth. The sophistication was immediately apparent. Each cylinder was designed with precise entrance holes, internal dimensions, calculated to accommodate natural comb-building behavior, and removable clay caps for easy harvest access. Egyptians didn't stop there. They understood something that took modern science centuries to rediscover: seasonal migration. Egyptian beekeepers floated their hives on Nile barges, moving them upstream as different crops bloomed throughout the river valley. Lotus flowers in the delta during flood season, clover and vegetables as the waters receded, date palms in the south during harvest time. This was migratory pollination 4,000 years before anyone coined the term. Think about that for a second. These beekeepers had reverse-engineered bee behavior with enough precision to industrialize honey production 4 millennia before the invention of modern apiology. The Greeks took a completely different approach. Aristotle, in his Historia Animalium, around 350 BCE, dedicated substantial portions to bee behavior with scientific precision that remained unmatched for centuries. He correctly observed the existence of a single dominant bee in each colony, described the division of labor between workers and drones, and documented seasonal behavioral changes with meticulous detail. He got almost everything right, except one fundamental fact. He assumed the dominant bee was male. The queen's sex wouldn't be confirmed until 1586, when Flemish naturalist Louis de Camusat finally settled the question through careful dissection. Extraordinary observational precision existing alongside fundamental misunderstanding. Science in its purest form. Beekeepers inherited and expanded on both ancient traditions with characteristic imperial efficiency and massive scale. Columella's first-century agricultural manual, De Re Rustica, outlined sophisticated hive management techniques still recognizable to modern professional beekeepers today. Optimal hive placement, seasonal feeding, swarm prevention, and disease management. The Romans had systematically industrialized honey production across their vast empire spanning 3 continents. By the height of Roman power, honey was not just food, it was currency medicine, embalming fluid, and religious offering simultaneously. No other commodity served so many different functions at once. A substance that could preserve a corpse, heal a wound, sweeten wine, and pay a soldier's wages should have been universally celebrated. But human beings are complicated, and honey, for all its gifts, was about to make some very powerful enemies indeed. Here is the first surprise this story has to offer. Honey, today's symbol of wholesome natural purity, spent centuries being feared, banned, and morally condemned by the very civilizations that should have known better. The ancient Israelites provide the earliest documented case. The Book of Leviticus, composed sometime between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, contains an explicit prohibition that puzzled theologians for centuries afterward. Honey could not be burned as an offering to God. This was a striking ban. Honey was abundant throughout the ancient Near East. It was valuable, precious, clearly a gift worthy of divine attention. But Leviticus was unambiguous. No honey on the altar. Rabbinic interpretation eventually settled on a theological explanation. Honey's tendency to ferment made it corrupt, ritually impure for sacrifice. the substance that preserved everything else was itself considered tainted. Sacred versus sinful. Pure versus forbidden. The contradiction only deepened over time. In 16th century Europe, physicians trained in Galenic medical theory actively warned patients away from honey. They argued it produced corrupt humors, aggravated bilious temperaments, caused dangerous fevers that could prove fatal. Leading medical authorities across universities in Paris, Bologna, and Vienna published detailed warnings against honey consumption, particularly for children, pregnant women, and anyone suffering from illness. The irony here is breathtaking. Honey's genuine antimicrobial properties, now scientifically validated and clinically proven, were being dismissed as dangerous at the precise historical moment. European medicine possessed no equivalent antibiotic tool whatsoever. Doctors were systematically throwing away the only broadly effective wound treatment available to them. Healing versus dangerous. Science versus superstition. The pattern repeated elsewhere. Among certain Islamic scholarly traditions, despite the Quran's explicit praise of honey in Surah An-Nahl, trade honey from non-Muslim regions was treated with commercial suspicion throughout the Ottoman Empire. Border crossings imposed heavy taxation specifically designed to discourage honey imports. By the 15th century, this had created a thriving black market in adulterated honey-inferior products mixed with cheaper syrups and sold as pure a fraud that would echo through centuries. Yet here's what makes this historical pattern remarkable. Every civilization that tried to restrict or condemn honey eventually reversed course. The Israelites continued eating it while prohibiting its sacrifice. European physicians quietly returned to honey-based remedies by the 17th century. Islamic merchants found theological justifications for expanded honey trade, because honey quite simply kept being right. Reversing centuries of suspicion doesn't happen on its own. It takes a specific kind of person, obsessive visionary, slightly ridiculous, to force the world to change its mind. In the case of modern beekeeping, that person was a New York farmer with a bad back and an idea that would remake an entire industry. Moses Quinby never intended to revolutionize anything. In the 1840s, he was simply a self-educated farmer in St. Johnsville, New York, managing dozens of traditional skep hives, dome-shaped straw baskets that had defined beekeeping for millennia. Every autumn following universal practice, he harvested honey by killing his entire bee colonies with sulfur smoke. Brutal and wasteful, but the only method anyone knew. Quinby suffered from severe chronic back pain. Every time he bent to tend his load to the ground, skeps the work was agony. What began as personal necessity became the engine of agricultural revolution. He was experimenting with hive designs that would allow him to work standing upright. The process was methodical, obsessive, driven by physical desperation rather than scientific curiosity. He documented every failure, every small improvement, every dead colony that resulted from his modifications. In 1853, he published his findings in a book with the thoroughly unglamorous title, Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. It became the sleeper hit of 19th century agricultural literature. Written in plain practical language by a working farmer rather than a university theorist, the book quietly demolished every received assumption about honey production. Quinby proved that bees could be managed without annual slaughter, that colonies could be moved safely, that honey harvests could be increased dramatically through intelligent intervention rather than brute exploitation. His real transformation came from his embrace of Lorenzo Lorraine Langstroth's 1851 invention, the movable frame hive. Langstroth, a Massachusetts minister and amateur naturalist, had discovered bee space, the precise 6 to 9 millimeter gap that bees will leave clear rather than seal with propolis or comb. This discovery enabled removable frames that could be lifted from hives without destroying the colony's architecture. Quinby became the first commercial-scale adopter of the Langstroth design. He proved it could work not just in a gentleman scientist's garden, but across a full commercial operation spanning hundreds of hives. The efficiency gains were immediate and dramatic. Where traditional skep beekeeping yielded perhaps 20 pounds of honey per colony per season, if the colony survived, Quinby's modified Langstroth hives regularly produced 60 to 80 pounds per colony annually, with colonies surviving indefinitely. Then in 1873, Quinby invented his masterpiece, the bellows smoker, a hand-pumped device with a metal nozzle that delivered controlled amounts of smoke precisely where needed. Before Quinby, beekeepers calmed bees by blowing pipe smoke at them manually or burning rags nearby, methods that were imprecise, dangerous, and largely ineffective. Quinby's smoker gave individual beekeepers precise control over bee behavior for the first time in human history. Every professional beekeeper on Earth still uses essentially identical equipment today. He died just 2 years after patenting the smoker in 1875, before fully witnessing its global adoption. The contrast is striking. A man in chronic physical pain, working in near obscurity on a New York farm, invented the two tools that would allow humanity to scale honey production into an industry worth over $9 billion annually by the 21st century. His name appears in almost no popular history. Moses Quinby never sought fame. He sought a way to tend his bees without his back breaking. He got both, and history forgot one of them entirely. But industrialization is a double-edged tool. The same efficiency that Quinby's innovations unlocked the ability to keep more bees, move more hives, harvest more honey didn't just feed the world. It also made honey valuable enough to fight over steal and ultimately destroy. This is where honey's benign image fractures completely. The story operates on two tracks, separated by centuries but connected by identical patterns of exploitation, fraud, and institutional willful blindness. The first track begins in colonial Brazil, where Portuguese explorers in the early 16th century encountered indigenous communities, particularly the Guarani and Tupinamba peoples, with sophisticated stingless bee traditions dating back millennia. The Portuguese weren't interested in learning. They were interested in extracting. Wax, not honey, was the prize. In pre-electric Europe, pure beeswax was the single most commercially valuable bee product. Churches consumed staggering quantities for altar candles considered essential for proper Christian worship. The Catholic Church's theological position was unambiguous. Beeswax candles symbolized Christ's pure body. Only pure wax would do. This demand drove what historians of material culture now call a wax economy across colonial Latin America and Africa. Indigenous and enslaved laborers were forced to harvest wild hives in conditions of extreme danger, climbing impossible cliff faces, working with minimal protective equipment, suffering mass bee stings that frequently proved fatal. The institutional Catholic Church became a colonial economic engine, preaching honey's spiritual purity while building an extraction system that systematically killed and enslaved the people who produced it. The contradiction was not subtle. It was conscious. Century West Africa, particularly in what is now Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, British and Dutch trading companies listed beeswax as a primary trade commodity in their commercial ledgers. The remarkable detail that survives in maritime shipping records tells the complete story. Beeswax and enslaved human beings appear in the same ledger entries with identical accounting methods, often on the same cargo manifests bound for European ports. The wax that lit European churches was harvested by people whose freedom those same churches claimed to care about. Think about that for a second. But this story's second track proves that institutional exploitation didn't end with the colonial period. It simply became more sophisticated. By the early 2000s, China had become the world's largest honey producer, accounting for nearly half of global production. When the United States and European Union imposed steep tariffs on Chinese honey imports, citing concerns about antibiotic contamination and unfair trade practices, Chinese exporters developed a response that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration would later call the largest food fraud in American history. Chinese honey was systematically shipped through intermediary countries, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, with falsified country of origin documentation. Honey produced in Chinese facilities was relabeled as Indian honey, Malaysian honey, Vietnamese honey. The fraud operated at massive scale for over a decade. Investigative journalist Andrew Schneider's 2011 Food Safety News investigation revealed the deeper problem. 76% of honey sold in U.S. grocery stores had been ultra-filtered, a process that removes pollen grains entirely. Pollen grains are the only definitive method for tracing honey's geographic origin. Without pollen, there is no proof of where honey actually came from. Major retailers were directly implicated. Walgreens, CVS Pharmacy, and McDonald's all sourced honey from supply chains involved in the laundering operation. But here's the crucial detail most investigations missed. Ultra-filtered honey meets no internationally recognized definition of honey at all. It is, legally speaking, in most jurisdictions, a honey-flavored syrup. The commodity that survived 3,300 years sealed in a pharaoh's tomb could not survive 30 years of industrial supply chains without being hollowed out and replaced with fraud. Consumers most harmed by honey adulteration are disproportionately lower-income shoppers, purchasing store-brand honey, the cheapest product on supermarket shelves. Premium artisanal honey, laboratory-tested and geographically traceable, remains available for people who can afford to care. Economic inequality extends even to fraud. And yet, despite the exploitation, the fraud, the systematic industrialization, honey's global reach only expanded. By the 21st century, almost every culture on Earth had woven it into their food, their medicine, and their identity. The question is how it got everywhere and what that journey looked like. Honey's conquest of the world began long before European colonization, but it accelerated once trade routes connected distant civilizations in systematic exchange. The ancient world established the foundation. India's Ayurvedic tradition, codified in the Karaka Samhita around 700 BCE, listed honey as one of 8 dietary essentials and described 5 distinct medicinal grades based on floral source and seasonal timing. China's first pharmacopoeia, the Sheneng Bencao Jing, from approximately 200 CE, classified honey as a superior grade tonic, capable of extending life and enhancing spiritual clarity. Across pre-Islamic Arabia, honey markets, souks al-asal, became defining features of major trading cities like Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad, where tribal chiefs levied honey tribute from nomadic communities as a form of portable, imperishable wealth. Period triggered exponential expansion. Arab traders carried honey and advanced beekeeping techniques along Silk Road routes deep into Central Asia and Persia, establishing apiaries from Samarkand to Isfahan. Norse and Germanic cultures developed entirely honey-dependent ceremonial traditions, with mead-fermented honey wine serving as their primary ritual drink for weddings, victories, and religious observances. The word honeymoon derives directly from the Northern European custom of gifting newlyweds a month's supply of mead to ensure fertility and good fortune. Ethiopia developed perhaps the world's most sophisticated honey culture. Tej honey wine flavored with gesho buckthorn remains the national drink today, produced from beekeeping traditions dating back at least 3,000 years. Ethiopian beekeepers use cylindrical bark hives suspended in trees, techniques essentially unchanged since biblical times. Colonial redistribution transformed entire ecosystems. European colonizers carried the western honeybee Apis mellifera to continents where it had never existed. First recorded arrival in North America, 1622, Virginia Colony, Australia, 1822, New Zealand, 1839, throughout South America by the mid-1600s. Indigenous peoples across these regions who maintained their own native bee traditions called the introduced European bee the white man's fly. 4 words that encapsulated an entire colonial dynamic. Today's production statistics reveal honey's complete global integration. China dominates, producing approximately 450,000 metric tons annually, nearly half of world output. Turkey produces roughly 110,000 metric tons. The remaining top 10 includes Argentina, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, India, Ethiopia, Mexico, and the United States in that order, according to recent FAO data. Consumption patterns tell a different story. Germany is the world's largest honey importer, despite being neither a major producer nor a honey-obsessed consumer culture. It serves as a European distribution hub, which makes it a critical node in international honey laundering networks. Meanwhile, New Zealand's Manuka honey commands prices reaching $100 per 100 grams. Gram for gram more expensive than silver. This premium exists entirely because of Manuka's uniquely high methyl glyoxal antibacterial concentration, a medicinal property now clinically validated in peer-reviewed research. The contrast is staggering. A product first gathered by a nameless human clinging to a cliff face in Mesolithic Spain now moves through a $9 billion global supply chain involving satellite-tracked shipping containers, international trade law, and laboratory isotope analysis for authenticity verification. Which brings us to the present and to perhaps the most important chapter of this entire story. Because everything honey is today, everything science is now discovering about what it can do, points to a future that the Mesolithic cliff climber could never have imagined, and to a crisis that might end it all. The same substance Howard Carter's team found in a 3,300-year-old tomb is now being deployed in 21st century operating theaters against one of modern medicine's most dangerous threats. Manuka honey-based wound dressings are actively used in NHS hospitals across the United Kingdom and in military field medicine by the U.S. Army Medical Corps. This is not folk remedy or alternative medicine. This is clinically trialed, FDA-cleared treatment marketed under the brand MediHoney, approved in 2007 following rigorous pharmaceutical testing protocols. Wound healing mechanism is now completely understood. It is hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture from bacterial cells, dehydrating them until they cannot survive. Upon contact with wound fluid, honey produces hydrogen peroxide, enzymatically creating a sustained antibacterial environment. Manuka honey provides an additional non-peroxide antibacterial pathway through its uniquely high methyl glyoxal concentration, which attacks bacterial proteins directly. In an era of rising antibiotic resistance, pharmacology, researchers are seriously reconsidering honey as a frontline tool against MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, a drug-resistant superbug that kills approximately 35,000 Americans annually. Laboratory studies show Manuka honey consistently destroys MRSA colonies that resist every conventional antibiotic available. The cliff climber's prize has become modern medicine's last resort. Renaissance is happening precisely as the biological system that produces honey faces potential collapse. Colony collapse disorder was first formally identified in 2006 in the United States, though beekeepers had been reporting strange disappearances for several years. Worker bees simply abandon their hives, leaving behind the queen honey stores, developing larvae, and all the infrastructure of a functioning colony. They vanish completely. By 2008, U.S. beekeepers had lost between 30 and 90% of their hives in affected regions. The economic damage was immediate and staggering. Commercial beekeeping operations that had operated successfully for generations were bankrupted overnight. Remain partially contested, but the pattern is clear. Neonicotinoid pesticides, particularly imidacloprid and clothianidin, disrupt bee navigation systems and immune responses. Varroa destructor mites spread viruses throughout colonies. Habitat loss eliminates diverse floral sources. Monoculture farming reduces bee dietary diversity below survival thresholds. The stakes extend far beyond honey production. Approximately 1/3 of global food production depends on bee pollination. California's almond industry requires 2 million rented bee colonies annually, more than the entire permanent U.S. bee population. Blueberries, avocados, apples, cherries, and countless vegetables depend on managed pollination services that may not exist in 30 years. The contrast is devastating. Humans spent 10,000 years learning to extract maximum value from bees. They may have spent the last 50 years inadvertently dismantling the biological system that makes bees possible. What does it mean, all of it? The cliff paintings and the Pharaoh's tomb, the colonial wax trade and the FDA fraud, Moses Quinby's bad back and the hospital wound wards treating MRSA with a 10,000-year-old remedy. What does honey of all things actually tell us about ourselves? For 10,000 years, humanity's relationship with honey was built on reverence and awe. From cliff paintings in Mesolithic Spain to Egyptian burial chambers, from Roman apiaries to Moses Quinby's revolutionary hives, honey represented something transcendent, a substance defying natural law, healing wounds, connecting earthly and divine. Then came the 20th century, industrial exploitation, colonial extraction, corporate fraud, environmental destruction through pesticides and monoculture. The insects creating honey were systematically poisoned by civilization, claiming to value their product. Science is rediscovering what ancient cultures knew. Honey heals, it preserves, it endures. Hospital wards deploy the same substance found in Tutankhamun's tomb against antibiotic-resistant superbugs. Ancient wisdom and cutting-edge medicine have converged. We found honey in a 3,300-year-old tomb and called it a miracle. Then we spent the next century doing everything we could to make it worthless. The bees apparently have not changed. We have. Given everything honey represents, human ingenuity, colonial greed, ecological fragility, possibility. What does our relationship with it look like from here? What surprised you most? The ancient history, modern fraud, or medical science? Leave a comment below. If this is history nobody taught you in school, there's more where this came from. Subscribe and like.